Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for returning somewhat. I'm expecting we'll have a couple of folks continue to trickle in since we did cut lunch a little short. Before I introduce our next speaker, I was just going to use this opportunity to just talk a little bit about the Cybersecurity for IoT program that I lead at NIST. So as some of you are probably aware of the background of NIST, we have a long and rich history, as Jim mentioned, in doing work in cybersecurity around research, around standards. We've done work in the cyber physical systems framework. We've done work in the cybersecurity framework, building profiles around smart manufacturing. We have work in the NCCOE around wireless infusion pumps. And around a year ago, or perhaps a little less than a year ago, NIST decided to pull together a program and pull all of this cybersecurity for IoT work into a single program, and that is the work that I'm currently leading at NIST. If you are interested in hearing more about our work, we do have a public-facing website. Primarily, it's to keep folks informed of work that we are doing here at NIST that tie and support cybersecurity for IoT. And you'll find links to other program areas in NIST that are supporting this area. So I think Jim may have touched on this earlier today, but we've been receiving feedback from our stakeholders that they think it would be helpful for NIST to look at providing guidance for federal agencies primarily on how to secure their infrastructures against the Internet of Things, or when doing the Internet of Things. Not quite sure what the right modifier is for that. So this is going to primarily be used as one of the inputs to our program as we develop our strategy and looking forward for next year and inform our next actions around what we might do in that space. And again, anything from today will be published. The plans are to publish a NIST IR that includes all the proceedings, any materials that our speakers may have submitted, as well as capture some notes from questions and answers that were provided. And for those of you that may have colleagues, I think Jim mentioned this, but I'll just repeat it again. There will be recordings of today's session, so if anybody you know wasn't able to make it, I know this being, Cybersecurity Awareness Month and Cyber Week, there were lots of people that had to make decisions and juggle lots of schedules. So still very happy with all of you that could make it here today. But you will be able to see those offline if needed. All right, and with no further ado, I will introduce Gilad, who is our next speaker. He is founder of the Internet of Things Privacy Forum, here to speak on IoT privacy threats. He is a privacy and information policy researcher whose broad work focuses on the IoT, identity management, U.S. and EU privacy and data protection regimes, and online trust. So, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to address all of you today. My name is Gilad Rosner, and I'm an information policy and privacy researcher. And I founded the nonprofit Internet of Things Privacy Forum, whose mission is to produce guidance and analysis and best practices to help industry and government to reduce privacy risk and innovate responsibly in the domain of connected devices. I know I'm first to speak after lunch, so I'll try to keep this punchy. For the last year, my research partner, Erin Keneally, a cybersecurity attorney at the Department of Homeland Security, and I have been conducting research on IoT privacy risks so as to better understand what's at stake and then suggest interventions and investments and future research. The work was funded by a generous grant from the Hewlett Foundation, and it'll be published later in the year. I'd like to share with you some of the findings preliminarily. I was asked to speak about the privacy threat landscape, so I'll focus on the risks and harms that Erin and I have been writing about. I have a few wordy slides, but it's because I'm a big believer in what one scholar long ago called thick description. So the research is based on 2 workshops, one on each coast with a total of 27 experts. one-on-one semi-structured interviews, and an extensive literature review. Our respondents came from industry, government, academia, advocacy groups, and standards development organizations. The data was then coded and analyzed using thematic content analysis techniques. So firstly, I'd like to define the Internet of Things for the purposes of this talk. Many definitions have been proposed over the years, and I'm not trying to add a new one, but just to synthesize a few that I've seen. For me, the IoT means devices that are not full-fledged computers. They're purpose-built items versus generic computing platforms like your laptop or your tablet or your phone. They have sensors like cameras and microphones, infrared detectors, accelerometers, and much more specialized sensors. They can communicate over networks. They bridge the physical world with the electronic one. And in the consumer space, they tend towards being unobtrusive. Now, ultimately, I see the term Internet of Things going away. Remember mobile computing? In the same way, more and more devices will come to have these characteristics such that it will be unremarkable. Now I'm going to launch into the privacy risks, threats, and harms that emerge from our workshops, interviews, and literature. And the first one is the IoT allows the tracking and analysis that happens online to occur in the physical world. Modern internet technologies allow for people's online activities to be tracked in the most granular levels: the web pages you visit, which ones you linger on, where your mouse is on the screen, what you buy, where your computer is, your age range, your gender, what you typed and then deleted, and the list goes on. Inferences from collected data, plus the merging of purchased third-party data, yields deep profiles about us, augmented in real time. Such tracking has been endemic to the online world of desktop, laptops, and mobile phones, but it's making the leap to the offline world. This trend has been happening gradually, as we can see with the use of in-store retail tracking technologies, CCTV, and Wi-Fi detection. But the increasing amount of cameras, microphones, and other sensors into consumer goods will fully enable the mature tracking practices that we see online to make the leap into our physical, social world. As you suspect, what will propel this forward is marketing. The government affairs manager of ESOMAR, a worldwide trade association for the market research industry, told one researcher that the future of advertising and marketing lies in passive and always-on data collection, and that the holy grail is real-time collection information about customer needs and emotions. Today, this is dependent on advances in mobile and wearable technology and correlation of geolocation with contextual and behavioral information. The value of passive data collection is instant access to transactions and conversations. Seen this way, biosensors and biometric data promise additional real-time understanding as people move throughout everyday life, the city, and retail spaces. Of course, it's not only marketing that will benefit from a much more sensor-rich environment. The manufacturers of products will get much more useful information about how their products are used so that they can continually improve them. In many examples, all kinds of tracking will be predicated on users giving them consent, but it remains an open question as to whether notice and consent, a central basis of the American privacy regime, is meaningful. Whether you feel that the pervasive panoptic monitoring of your online activities is problematic, and whether the extension of that monitoring into public, private, and intimate spaces is cause for worry, depends on your politics and how vulnerable you feel. A corollary to increasing offline traffic is the diminishment of private spaces. I'm using the term private spaces here in the sense of having places to retreat to where you can control who can be present, who is listening, who's watching, places of solitude, seclusion, and reserve. The most obvious example of a private space is the home, and the most obvious example of technology that has the potential to diminish its private character is the Amazon Echo, Google Home, and other emerging virtual assistants. These devices are always on. However, work by the Future of Privacy Forum shows us that there is important nuance in the types of always-on technology. Most of these virtual assistants need a gate word or a wake word before they start transmitting anything you say to them. But the virtual assistants are growing eyes, as we can see with this latest addition to the Echo family, which was just announced last month. We can also see from Amazon's marketing material that they clearly intend for some people to place this camera on the nightstand right next to the bed. If the home is a private space, surely the bedroom is more so. One privacy advocate I spoke to related the concern of private spaces to the democratic values of freedom from surveillance and unwanted interference and freedom of thought. I think you can put them in context of the IoT and ask, is, for example, us having devices in our home that are maybe surreptitiously recording us or collecting and sharing information that we're unaware of, or even just the fact that they're in our homes recording, is that a violation of the idea that we are free from surveillance, from government interference, that in our homes it is a private space? I think once that fundamentally that idea is challenged, then you have questions of, is it possible to ever find a private space? And how necessary is private space to freedom of thought? I would answer that it's very necessary. It's at the core. As I mentioned, there are multiple models for triggering data collection in the home, and so one can imagine a spectrum of being aware fully that it's occurring to being completely unaware. The gate word is a useful mechanism for control and awareness, but it is a design choice by product makers, and there are others. Also, the introduction of cameras into the home is rather new, so the defaults and design choices are in their infancy. The point is, sensor-rich devices in the home, in cars, and in public, because the question of how much privacy you have in public is far from settled, introduces third-party observation into places that people have historically seen or desired to be private. If you accept that private spaces are essential to the human condition, and you may not, then we must cast a critical eye on the proliferation of sensors in spaces we retreat to and believe to be a secluded domain. A key danger is what the privacy community calls chilling effects. Florian Schaub of the University of Michigan explained it this way. You think you're being observed, so you behave differently. There are also habituation aspects. You might behave differently at first, and then you kind of become attuned to the technology being there, so you become maybe a bit more laissez-faire in terms of how you behave. You forget that these devices are active, but that doesn't mean that you're not leaving digital traces of mundane behavior anymore, and this data can reveal information about your preferences, what you like, what you don't like, or your health, your family situation, your financial situation, all kinds of different things that people prefer to keep private. One of the challenges facing the privacy community is detecting and measuring abstract harms like chilling effects, unwanted revelation, or stigmatization. There's a small amount of research that attempts to do this, but the fact is it's difficult to articulate and evidence. This has the effect of making it very hard to protect via legislation and adjudication, especially in the United States, where privacy protection for society tends to be reduced to preventing concrete economic harms and ensuring that people consented. However, if you are persuaded by the argument that people need private spaces in which to thrive, and that the connected devices appearing in the marketplace have the potential to diminish those spaces, we must bring policy, technological, and design strategies to bear upon the issue. The most private of spaces is the body. In our liberal democratic tradition, freedom of thought is sacrosanct, and we have a great many laws that prevent or heavily regulate intrusion of the body, such as forced blood samples or unwanted medical procedures. Medical information about the body is one of the privileged information types, and in the United States, its disclosure is governed by HIPAA and other statutes. Privacy scholar Gary T. Marks writes that informational privacy encompasses physical privacy. The latter can refer to insulation resulting from natural conditions such as walls, darkness, distance, skin, clothes, and facial expression. These can block or limit outputs and inputs. Bodily privacy is one form of this. This is seen in crossing the borders of the body to implant something such as a chip or a birth control device, or to take something from it such as a tissue, fluid, or a bullet. But bodily privacy is not just a matter of the corporeal. Even as far back as 1890, when the oft-cited Warren and Brandeis conceived of the right to privacy, they included thoughts, sentiments, and emotions. Cameras on your nightstand, in your television, in retail stores, in the eyes of your children's toys, on the front of your phone, coupled with biometric sensors of fitness devices and other wearables, is slowly ushering in emotion detection technology. Andy McStay, one of the world's foremost researchers on the use and privacy issues of emotion detection, stated, "We're seeing a net rise of interest in sentiment and emotion capture. The industries are really wide-ranging, from automobiles, insurance, health, recruitment, media, basically anywhere it's useful to understand emotions. In terms of kinds of industries that are really taking the lead on this, advertising and marketing is one of the obvious ones. Increasingly, we're seeing retail move into that area as well, all sorts of different sectors, ranging literally from sex toys all the way up to national security agencies and all the marketing and organizational stuff in between. One of Professor McStay's research respondents, the chief insight officer at an advertising firm, was dubious of traditional marketing surveys and focus groups and sought better methods to understand customers, including biometric data about emotion to understand brand levers, or how to get people to act, click, buy, investigate, feel, or believe. This objective involves understanding people through all of their devices and interaction points, i.e. wearable devices, mobile, and IoT. In general, the aim is to collect it all, so to build more meaningful interaction with brands. Professor McStay noted this executive's interest in emotional transparency, or the unfolding of the body, to reveal reactions, indications of emotions, feelings about brands, tracing of customer journeys, and information that will help create meaningful brands. Given the advertising industry's growing hunger for the fullest range of human data, the incorporation of emotion detection across a range of industries, the value of emotion data in creating richer gaming and entertainment experiences, the broadening capabilities of sensors and penetration of those sensors deeper into private and public spaces, it seems likely that we will face questions about our emotional privacy. Professor McStay's existing and forthcoming work on the subject is far deeper and more nuanced than I could hope to describe in this short presentation, but when interviewing him, I asked him, what's at stake with the collection of intimate information and the datafication of everyday emotional life? He answered, in a sense, it depends on your politics. You could say not very little. But as a minimum, what's at stake is the capacity to understand people in richer ways than we haven't seen before. So certainly in the marketing and advertising context, what's at stake is the capacity to get people to buy more stuff. So when you talk about what underpins getting people to buy more stuff, essentially what you're talking about is the controlling and the manipulation of human behavior. In terms of what's at stake, as a minimum, nobody could disagree that there's a better than average chance of raising the capacity to manipulate human behavior, typically in a consumer setting. The introduction of more sensing devices into the human environment has the potential to sweep up increasing amounts of children's data, both intentionally and in intentionally consented ways and unintentional ways. Consider any camera in your home, in retail spaces, or in public. Consider the emergence of internet-connected toys. You may have heard about a wildly insecure doll named My Friend Kayla, whose security was so bad, a complaint was filed with the FTC and foreign regulators, and Germany banned the doll outright. Not long after, we saw a data breach of internet-connected toys with microphones that allowed parents and children to exchange voice messages. 2.2 million of those voice exchanges were exposed when it was found they were sitting unprotected on a server. Now, those two examples are security issues that led to potential or actual privacy violations of children's data. Given the very weak security posture of emerging devices, it's inevitable we will see more of these. But there are also the more abstract questions of children's privacy to consider. How does an increase in the monitoring of human activity relate to children? What will awareness of always-on devices do to children's behavior? If private spaces are under threat, what does that mean for child development? Adults can ostensibly consent to some of the IoT being introduced, but A, is that consent sufficiently meaningful with regard to the collection of children's data? And B, what of the non-consensual capture of data that occurs in public and retail environments? One of the first toys to capture the public's attention was Hello Barbie. With this upgrade, Barbie can finally converse with children. Instead of always on, you must press a button to cause Barbie to start listening. That's a good privacy design choice, as is Mattel's pledge to use strong encryption. Mattel offers also parents the ability to review recordings of everything their children say to Barbie, which is required by the U.S. Children's Privacy Statute, COPPA. Mattel also makes it very easy for parents to share these adorable utterances with others via social media. Children form personal relationships with their toys, and one legal scholar I interviewed wondered about how those relationships are impacted by the introduction of microphones, AI, and network connections. She said, Barbie is an iconic toy that people remember. She's really intended to be a peer. When you set her up, one of the first things that she says is that you're one of her best friends and she feels like she can tell you anything. She, through her design, creates this really intimate and important role in a child's life, both through those big statements, "You're my best friend, I can tell you anything," but also we know that Barbies are kind of powerful. If someone says, "I can tell you anything," you don't expect that the intimacy that comes from a statement like that to also mean, "I'm recording everything you're saying and posting it on an internet platform that can also be viewed by your parents who can share it on their social media sites." Many U.S. lawyers and researchers believe that COPPA is a good law by which to approach children's privacy issues, which requires security, verifiable parental consent, and the right for parents to review children's data and to delete it. The broader questions of the social and psychological impact on children from the introduction of network toys and a more surveilled environment, however, requires much, much more study. Before wrapping up this abbreviated tour of the privacy risks that my partner and I are researching, I want to introduce a voice of dissent. I've tried to touch upon privacy threats that the law may be ill-suited to address. Threats to abstract ideas such as the preservation of liberty, of intimacy, of democracy, of a healthy society are difficult to articulate and evidence. And so someone may reasonably ask, is this threat inflation? The use of fear-inducing rhetoric to inflate artificially the potential harm of new development or technology poses to certain classes of the population, especially children, or to society or the economy at large. Adam Thierer of George Mason University, both a participant in one of our workshops and the author of a number of papers on IoT subjects, maintains a consistent, deep skepticism of technopanics, a moral panic centered on societal fears about a particular contemporary technology, instead of merely the content flowing over that technology or medium. A key word in Thierer's definition of threat inflation is artificially, and it must be seen in light of another of his statements. While cyberspace has its fair share of troubles and troublemakers, there is no evidence that the internet is leading to greater problems for society than previous technologies did. It is this arguable point upon which Thierer's valuable skepticism and the debate to which it contributes balances. Thierer and others argue for a variety of non-legislative ways to manage social changes brought about by the evolutionary advancements of the IoT. In the main, he and his colleagues are concerned with ensuring that innovation is not derailed by heavy-handed precautionary regulation. I, for one, am not worried about the health of capitalist enterprise. It seems to be doing just fine. But concerns over the preservation of private spaces, over a panoptic world in which children are increasingly observed by third parties, where adults chill their behavior and their speech because of the specter of monitoring, and where data collection leads to greater degrees of manipulation. These are macro-social possibilities that require all hands on deck: law, transparency, norm entrepreneurship, public discourse, social psychological research, and a willingness to let the omnipresent capitalist drive to sell products sometimes take a back seat to the greater social good. Thank you. I'd be happy to take your questions. Good night, everybody.
Thanks for your talk. I have a question.
Yes.
You said a lot in a short period of time there. I did hear the word consent go by at some point, and I just want to understand what your point was about that, in the sense that, you gave the example of the Barbie, you gave the example of the Amazon Echo. I happen to have neither of those things in my house, but you can imagine that I could, right? I could simply, I've got my smartphone in my hand. I could probably have it at my house by the time I go home today. So, but that would be my choice. And so, how is that a problem that I'm choosing to have these cameras on my nightstand or in my child's toy? Is that a problem that needs to be solved?
So, consent is predicated on knowing what you're consenting to. Otherwise, it's meaningless. And this is the place where consent tends to fall down.
Those two things are key functions of those. This ability to record or headline functions of these two consumer goods. So
agreed. But that also means that a purchaser is always this person who is fully aware of the capabilities of the device. And so many people want to participate in the markets that we have by purchasing lots of goods. They purchase the goods for lots of different reasons. Maybe their kids say, I want this thing, I want this thing, I want this thing, and they buy it. So There isn't an issue if you are a fully informed person.
So people lack the information to understand, despite it being the headline thing that this thing can record, they maybe don't understand that these recordings could be sent to somebody distant that doesn't know me and therefore used in ways that I don't anticipate.
That's an aspect.
That's the issue? I mean,
that
what
is
is the
an
aspect
issue.
that I'm not aware of that I'm consenting to as...
Well, so firstly, the question with consent and adults and children is that you're consenting to things that the children may not ultimately understand in their relationship with the devices. Also, the way that you're describing consent is as a fully informed individual. And I think if anybody has a variety of family members who have technology in their house and they don't know everything that the tech does or is capable of doing, then the question of consent starts to become hazy. Essentially, consent is based upon the idea that you know what you're getting into, right?
There's a lack of information about what these things can do amongst all the people that may participate with it, and thus they're not consenting to this.
Well, yeah, and also the people who walk into your house are not necessarily consenting to be on the cameras that you have in there either.
Right.
So it's not that there's a single problem with consent, it's that consent is generally problematic when you look at it from different ways.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, maybe we can get the microphone so that it gets onto the webcast.
The consent thing, when I'm sitting over here,
Oh,
sir.
hi. Sorry, the lights are in my
I walk
face.
with a stick.
You're protected by anonymity from darkness.
Here in the back.
Okay.
Anyways, the implied consent is we buy a product, anything, especially an electronic product, it's got these are the rules. And it tells there in those rules, in speak that I don't speak. There's a lawyer in the house that lawyers speak, that you are giving their consent when you buy the product to use the product, and thus, as an adult, if it's also for a child, as you're the adult, you are implying consent because you're letting your child play with that.
Yep.
And it's just so fascinating, the things that you've said that we just don't realize and don't think about the implied consent of a product. It's like the person that was just thrown in jail because somebody recorded a conversation on the telephone. And again, we know that in the back of our minds, you're supposed to tell someone you're recording it. And it's in the packaging that you're supposed to tell that person. But again, it's just you're passing it over. And I think that's what so many of us adults do. We pass over what the product can do, like the refrigerator, or like like a laptop with a camera in it. And I cover mine's covered over with a piece of tape. I don't want people to be able to turn that camera on in my house.
And there's a distinction to be drawn between the idea of your camera on your computer being turned on surreptitiously and stated, specific, intentional, designed-in functions. It's important when you think about privacy topics to separate illegitimate use of things and legitimate use of things. Because illegitimate use of things follows a completely different track, and it is actually the main topic of what we're talking about today in this colloquium, which is security. Security tries to prevent illegitimate use. But what I'm trying to talk about in a lot of these topics is the legitimate use, the use that is intentional or intentional by the manufacturer. And so the only point I guess I'm trying to make is that I think it's really important to remember that when you wonder about the privacy implications of the rollout of these devices, do not be seduced by the discussion about conflating the discussion about illegitimate use and legitimate use. Because the legitimate use is the stuff that's, by definition, legal, and what you are signing up for. You're not signing up to be hacked. You're not signing up for your webcam to be taken over. But you are signing up for a multiplicity of third parties getting access to the data that these devices collect.
So I just wanted to add a point based on that initial question about what you're consenting to, and I think there is actually a lot of research that people aren't actually very good at projecting future. They're not very good at risk assessment in terms of future harm, and you only need to look at product safety for those kinds of issues, right? I mean, people are very happy to buy cars without. Or not, maybe not happy, but very willing to buy cars without seatbelts, right? And certainly not going to pay extra for that. Mainly because, right, you think, well, I'm not going to get in an accident. So this is why it's very inherent. It's really a risk management issue. We don't accept that in product safety. Certainly there are always things that are unexpected, but we expect manufacturers to think about how harms could arise from products in the safety world. And I think this is, at least in NIST space, and what we're trying to do with privacy engineering is think in the same way about problems that can arise from informational products.
Yeah, just to take a European example, consent is only one of the legitimate bases by which you can collect. And, in America it is the prime basis. But there have to be, essentially, consent is a good thing because in the absence of consent it's surveillance. But consent is not the end-all, be-all, and in particular because of Naomi's point that downstream harms are very hard for human beings to conceive of.
So the question then, that I have is the litigation strategy further down the road, to coin your phrase, 15 years from now when my 7-year-old son realizes that all of his private information was revealed, and now his job, as they are affected now by social media, by medical treatment, where then does his consent lie within the litigation process?
I'm not a lawyer, so I cannot speak to litigation or litigation strategies. But I guess I can say more broadly is what I've been thinking about is how we, in purchasing these devices, which happens on a broad spectrum of reasons, we are bringing this world about where it will be more monitored, period. And so we are also bringing children into that world. And so children now will be adults in a world where this degree of monitoring is much more institutionalized, much more pervasive, and much more normalized. And so it's the world of speculation to wonder what will be the impact of that in terms of their ability to get a job or their ability to speak their mind. We just don't know. And so this is why I believe we need to look to the guardians of the greater social health. And so I put the question to you, who is that? Who is responsible for ensuring liberty and freedom of thought? Today or tomorrow? At any time. Who is responsible for that? Who takes the role in guarding macrosocial processes and political orientations for the long-term health of a country? Who is responsible for that? Man, I don't know about that.
Big job.
Yeah.
Gilad, one question. So you're talking a lot about the creation of these enormous data stores, and one could take comfort in the fact that it's too much data and often there's not. But the rise of artificial intelligence and the application of machine learning to these data stores, the ability of machines to actually do a lot of the identification, a lot of the categorization. I've seen recent reports of research that indicates that the machines can look at a picture of someone and tell between a straight person and a gay person.
Don't believe those. Let's just stay right now. Do not believe the studies that claim to be that predictive of based on a photo. Let me
Excellent.
just throw in a massive amount of skepticism.
I'm happy to hear that, but I guess ultimately, as we teach machines to do these things more and more effectively, we're going to have a situation where our privacy is. Do we even have an ability to consent at that point? I mean, it's almost like it's almost impossible to conceive of the level of at which the surveillance, the collection, is matched with the capacity to analyze.
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, America's based upon the reasonable expectation of privacy standard, but if everything's got a camera in it, do you reasonably expect that you have privacy in a whole bunch of places? The reasonable expectation of privacy standard collapses when you are aware of omnipresent monitoring. Why would you expect that you have privacy? And if you base a legal system heavily upon that expectation of privacy and you remove the expectation, what are you protecting? What is the impetus to protect privacy if you are basing it upon expectation? And so no, consent falls apart. Because think about one of the first places in academic research that the consent problem was identified was giving consent to having a medical procedure done. By definition, your surgeon is a professional in a different class than you. They are licensed. They know better than you by definition. And then they say, is it cool if we cut you open and do these 7 or 8 things? Here's the risks. And as a society, we didn't have a choice. I'm not to say I have a problem with this, but we accept the idea of consent. So you're consenting to the procedure in terms of, yes, you may, but you're not consenting to the procedure in terms of, I totally get it. I understand the downstream risks of you, substituting a part of my heart with an animal's heart. You can't do that. And so this is identified decades ago as a problem. These are specialists. And so now, especially in a culture of data hoarding, where you do not know what you're going to do with the data. I mean, one of the great refrains of big data is we need all the data because, down the road, it might be more valuable. We're going to mine the heck out of that, and today data mining processes are going to help us see things that we couldn't see just with human beings, and so we need all the data. And so if the companies collecting the data don't even know what it's good for, how can you consent to thinking about what the potential collection risks are to you? Do we have time for one more? I like this.
Hi.
Okay, you got your orders. Short one.
As today, the business community doesn't actually value data. Therefore, they don't actually put appropriate controls, be it via privacy or security. Have you considered, maybe there's an economic system that if you choose to allow that camera to be on, that there's an economic value to you because you are, in fact, helping train so-and-so's machine learning or processes like that, and you make that choice, and then you make the choice of turning that off?
So I disagree with your first statements that businesses don't value data. If that were the case, man, I wouldn't feel so bad about not investing in Google. So businesses sure as heck value data. What they don't place a value upon, security breaches or the abrogation of privacy because they exist within a regulatory regime and economic logic that tells them how to behave. Essentially, privacy harms are negative externalities that businesses who perpetrate them do not feel. Same with security. Sometimes we do, sometimes there's an FTC action here and there, and those are great when they occur, but there's a structural question as to whether or not, when people experience these types of harms, whether the perpetrator of the harm is going to feel the pain from that, or is that pain sloshed around. That's just the first part. The second part is whether or not I feel that there's an economic benefit for me participating in training data and product improvement. Sure. Okay. I think that in an abstract way, I'm pleased that the march of progress is being partially contributed to by my use of a device. And yes, there is a tension here between the idea of somebody who is making an actual rational choice to purchase something and this wide spectrum of others. And the question, because it's consent, the way it's currently treated is fire and forget. America doesn't even have a good mechanism for consent revocation or data deletion. The right to erasure should be uncontroversial, and yet, in America, that causes fights across the dinner table and definitely across various political contexts. But I mean, is it so strange for me to want to be able to say to a company whom I know has the data, delete it. I don't want you to hold it anymore. Is that so odd? This is about rights and control. Ultimately, the economy benefits by people being happy about what they're doing and purchasing and participating in. And so I believe that the more you give them control, the economy will be much improved for it. Thank you.
I know Gilad was enjoying that, but you do have a plane to catch, right?
Not for 7 hours.
Okay. All right, so our next speaker is Andy Arias, who is an attorney at the Division of Privacy and Identity Protection at the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission, focusing on enforcement and policy matters involving consumer privacy and data security. She will speak on consumer concerns. Thanks, Andy.
Excuse me, put your slides up real quick. Good.
And to advance. To advance.
Yeah, you can use that, or you can use this, whichever one's easier.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having me. Again, Andy Arias from the Federal Trade Commission. Before I begin, I have to disclose, because I do work for the government, and I just have to say it, sorry. So the views expressed today are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Commission or any one of its commissioners. So I know that we are running short on time, so I am going to go right into it. So before I talk about the IoT landscape for consumers, I thought it'd be good to give you guys a little bit of background about the Federal Trade Commission. Although I know our previous speaker already spoke a little bit about us, it might be good to give you guys our view of how we fit into this kind of puzzle of the Internet of Things. So let's talk about the FTC. The FTC is an independent law enforcement agency responsible for protecting consumers and promoting competition. As part of this consumer protection mission, the FTC enforces a wide range of laws to protect the privacy and security of consumer data. The FTC accomplishes this mission in a three-pronged approach, and I think this is important that everyone understands that although we are a law enforcement agency, we do approach this in three primary ways: enforcement, policy work, and education. Let me briefly touch upon each of these as they relate to the Internet of Things. Enforcement is really the FTC's primary tool to protect consumers' information. Let me give you a snapshot. FTC has brought over 500 privacy and security-related cases, including cases against IoT device manufacturers TrendNet, which, at least in our case, was a manufacturer of home security cameras and baby monitors, Asus Tech for routers, and Vizio for smart TVs. We also have a pending case against a D-Link for routers and for IP cameras presently. The FTC's enforcement actions send an important message to manufacturers about the need to take reasonable steps to safeguard the privacy and security of IoT devices. At the same time, though, the FTC has recognized that there is no such thing as perfect security. Rather, security is a continuous process of risk management. The Commission has also undertaken several policy initiatives in the area of IoT, specifically relating to privacy and data security. For example, the FTC hosted an IoT workshop and issued a report. I'll talk about that a little bit later in my slides. Both last year and this year, the Commission staff filed comments with the NTIA relating to IoT, including a comment that recommended best practices for IoT manufacturers, such as informing consumers of the security support period for IoT devices. In January of this year, the Commission announced an IoT Inspector Challenge, a public competition aimed at creating tools like security update wizards to protect IoT devices in consumer homes. And we recently announced our winner, so I'll talk about that a little bit later in my slides and what the winner finally figured out for us. More recently, the FTC hosted workshops exploring the privacy and data security implications of specific IoT devices, such as drones, smart TVs, and connected cars. And I'll stop here to let you guys know that if you're interested in any of these particular devices, all of our workshops are telecasted and recorded, and all that information is freely available at business.ftc.gov if you want to check it out. In a related initiative, we've also put out several blog posts, including, for example, a blog post on the botnet attacks. And later this year, hopefully this year, I can't promise, the Commission will be issuing a report on mobile devices, arguably the most mature IoT product market, based on information that the Commission received from 8 mobile device manufacturers. So that's the policy work. Now let's talk about education. So the FTC educates consumers and businesses through published guidance and posts on its business and consumer blogs. For example, the Commission's Business Education Guide, Start with Security, describes data security fundamentals, such as implementing a process for regularly updating software. The FTC also held 4 workshops in San Francisco, Austin, Seattle, and Chicago to promote this Start with Security initiative. We also have put out a careful connections guidance addressing IoT device manufacturers specifically, and we've put out several blog posts on similar issues. So let me just briefly talk about the FTC's laws that it has at its disposal and how we go ahead and use them in the area of IoT specifically. So like I mentioned, we are primarily a civil law enforcement agency, and our operative statute is Section 5 of the FTC Act, which prohibits unfair or deceptive acts or practices. So a company acts deceptively if it makes materially misleading statements or omissions. A company engages in unfair acts or practices if its practices cause or are likely to cause substantial injury to consumers that is neither reasonably avoidable by consumers nor are weighed by the countervailing benefits to consumers or to competition. What does that mean in the context of data security? Well, let me give you an example of deception first. If, for example, a company sells an IP camera that is called Secure View, it puts locks on the packaging. It says it's a really good camera for safety purposes. It's good to secure your home, to secure your babies and whatnot. And it turns out that the company does not actually test the camera for security issues, just for functionality issues, and has no way to verify that, in fact, it's for secure purposes. That could lead to a deception count under Section 5 of the FTC Act. Now, let me highlight unfairness, which, as I mentioned, requires harm that was not reasonably avoidable by consumers, nor outweighed by countervailing benefits. Within the data security sphere, what could that look like? Well, let's say that you have a restaurant, and that restaurant failed to secure its credit card payment system, leading to identity and credit card fraud of hundreds of consumers. That would be the harm prong. Consumers could not avoid this unless maybe they stopped going to this restaurant. So that's the not reasonably avoidable prong. And 3, there was no reason why the system could not have been secured, since it could have maybe secured with simple encryption methods. That would be the no countervailing benefits prong. So that's how the Section 5 of the FTC Act works. In addition to Section 5 of the FTC Act, we do have other laws at our disposal that I know some of the other speakers have highlighted. The Commission's Safeguards Rule, which implements the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, for example, provides data security requirements for non-bank financial institutions. The Fair Credit Reporting Act requires consumer reporting agencies to use reasonable procedures to ensure that the entities to which they disclose sensitive consumer information have a permissible purpose for receiving that information. And 2, imposes safe disposal obligations on entities that maintain consumer information. So 1, you need to have proper procedures to collect the information and make sure that you're not collecting it and disseminating it to the wrong folks. And 2, if you're going to get rid of it, do so safely. And finally, we do have the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA, which requires reasonable security for children's information collected online. So, with Section 5 of the FTC Act, as well as these other statutes and laws, the FTC has brought a number of high-profile cases against various well-known companies that failed to protect consumers' personal information. Specifically, they failed to keep reasonable security. In the area of IoT, we've brought cases against D-Link, ASUS, TrendNet, and HTC America. We've also brought a series of cases against companies that failed to protect consumers' personal information. In the area of IoT, though not listed in this slide because it's a fairly recent case, we've brought a case against Vizio. So I'm also a fan of definitions, like Dr. Gilad, and so I like to begin with definitions before we jump right into the subject of the consumer landscape in IoT. So what is IoT? As we explained in our IoT report, the Internet of Things refers to things such as devices or sensors other than computers, smartphones, or tablets that connect, communicate, or transmit information with or between each other through the Internet. That's our definition. So there's a fierce debate as to when IoT really began, right? Was it in the 90s when the first connected toaster was released? Or in 99 when Kevin Ashton coined the term? Or in 2000 when LG released its first internet-connected refrigerator? I guess it really doesn't matter when IoT was coined as a term. The point is that it's clearly here. Gartner estimates that consumers and businesses will use more than 8 billion IoT devices in 2017 alone. That's a pretty big market, and that's why it's worthy of us to be looking at it more seriously as we are today. So, in light of this ever-growing area, the FTC has put out several reports relating to IoT. We put a workshop and thereafter released a report in 2015 relating to IoT. In tandem, we released Careful Connections, guidance on businesses on how to develop and maintain IoT devices. That same year, we released Start with Security, which is 10 guiding principles for businesses developed from our various enforcement actions over time. And more recently, in 2017, we released Cross-Device Tracking Report, a report based on our workshop relating to the collection of personal information across platforms. But today, I'd like to focus first on our report relating to IoT. It's a great report that I think does a nice job of touching upon the various benefits and risks of IoT for consumers. So, this report outlines various consumer benefits derived from IoT, including in the areas of, for example, healthcare. This includes things like insulin pumps and blood pressure cuffs that are now connected to the internet. Such devices can reduce costs while giving consumers the ability to record, track, and monitor their own vital signs. This can be especially beneficial for aging patients, allowing them to manage their healthcare at home. By being connected to the internet, these devices can give more real-time advice, but also provide accessibility to professional healthcare providers. Home automation, things like thermostats and home appliances. These can help achieve greater energy efficiency and reduce costs. For example, home automation systems can provide consumers with a single platform that can connect all of their devices within the home. Similarly, sensors known as water bugs can notify consumers if their basements have flooded. And thermostats can automatically adjust temperature settings depending on the time of day and presence of people in the house. In transportation, these can lead to things like safety and convenience benefits. For example, sensors on a car can notify drivers of dangerous road conditions or obstacles. Connected cars can also offer real-time vehicle diagnostics to drivers and service facilities, internet radio, navigation, weather, traffic information, automatic alerts to first responders when airbags are deployed, and smartphone control of the starter and other aspects of the car. Heck, in the near future, cars may even drive themselves, right? We actually learned about that in our recent workshop on connected cars. And there's also societal benefits. I know that, there's concerns about big data, but at the same time, the aggregation of big data can lead to research and breakthroughs. For example, big data analysis of information collected from connected health devices can facilitate health research and lead to breakthroughs in treatment. Similarly, this type of analysis of data collected from, for example, public infrastructure to detect, for example, the lighting patterns on public streets can help improve energy efficiency. These types of analyses can also help target public service messages and resources relevant to certain populations, including low-income and disadvantaged communities. And we talk about this at length in our big data report, which I'm not going to cover today, but I do want to highlight that we have looked at the big data and how it can really affect and help low-income and underserved populations. But of course, there's privacy risks involved with all this information as well being out there. For example, IoT information can lead to the direct collection of sensitive personal information. That includes things like geolocation, financial account numbers, or health information. It can also lead to the collection of personal information, habits, and locations and physical conditions over time. For example, as a consumer, I think nowadays you can see a consumer who wears an IoT fitness band to monitor sleeping patterns. That person may also drive a connected car so that their family can see in real time where they are. Use a set-top box to stream action movies over the internet. And use IoT water bugs to alert them when the faucet is left running for too long. The potential for cross-device tracking to associate and aggregate information about consumers' sleeping patterns, driving habits, movie preferences, and household activity implicates privacy risks not previously contemplated in the era of desktop computers. This is particularly concerning if this data is acquired and aggregated without consumers' knowledge or consent, or without regard to the accuracy of that data as well, especially when there's so many people in a house who are using the same devices over time. So, like its benefit counterpart, the amalgamation of various sources can lead to privacy risks as well. For example, car insurance companies can now use data from connected cars to base insurance rates on consumers' actual driving habits, like number of hard brakes, miles driven, and amount of time driving between midnight and 4 a.m., and others might use IoT data to make in-house credit, insurance, or other eligibility type of decisions. In the area of security, IoT devices, as with desktop or laptop computers, a lack of security in IoT devices can enable intruders to access and misuse personal information collected or stored on the device itself. So more and more devices are collecting more and more information, and this can lead and facilitate the identity theft and fraud. Second, security vulnerabilities in particular IoT devices can act as entry points for attacks into consumers or businesses' networks, likely increasing exposure to security risk across entire systems. And third, and more importantly, security vulnerabilities in IoT devices can potentially lead to not only data security risks, but also threats to people's personal, physical safety. For example, vulnerabilities in IoT insulin pumps or pacemakers can result in significant injury or even death to a consumer. An attack on a vulnerable connected car can lead to engine failure or a loss of control. And an insecure IoT alarm system can open up a home to danger. We recognize that similar risks exist with traditional computers and computer networks, but they may be heightened in the Internet of Things space, in part because many IoT chips are inexpensive and disposable, and many IoT devices are quickly replaceable with newer versions. As a result, businesses may not have an incentive to support software updates for the full useful life of these devices, potentially leaving consumers with vulnerable devices. Moreover, it may be difficult or impossible to apply updates to certain devices. So now that I've covered some of the benefits and risks involved in IoT devices, let's talk about the consumer experience with these devices. So many connected devices often do not have a traditional user interface. As such, these companies often have limited capacity to explain about the collection, use, and protection of personal information. So to communicate with consumers, we at the FTC have urged companies to consider explaining collection, use, and protection of information through choices at point of sale, tutorials, codes on the device, choices during setup, management portals or dashboards, icons, out-of-band communications requested by consumers, general privacy menus, and just generally we want companies to be thinking about the user experience approach. So let me give you an example of when privacy choices are not well communicated to consumers, how things can go wrong in the IoT space. We recently brought a case against Vizio, a manufacturer of smart TVs. And in that case, we alleged that consumers that purchased new Vizio televisions beginning in August of 2014 had tracking pre-installed and enabled by default on those televisions, but received no on-screen notice of the collection of their viewing data. For televisions that were purchased in February of 2014, To install default tracking after purchase, an initial pop-up notification appeared on the screen, as you can see up on the slide. This notification, however, provided no information about the collection of viewing data or any ACR software, nor did it directly link to the settings menu or privacy policy. It simply called it smart interactivity. I still don't know what that means. So we allege that this was a deceptive practice on the part of Vizio. So to settle the case, Vizio agreed to 1, stop unauthorized tracking, 2, disclose prominently its TV viewing collection practices, 3, get consumers express consent before collecting and sharing that information instead of setting it up by default as it was before. And in addition, the company had to delete most of its data it collected and put a privacy program in place that evaluates Vizio's practices and its partners. Okay, now let's turn to security and the consumer experience there. The consumer experience has to improve in terms of security. What do I mean by this? As evidenced by many of our cases, the software provided to consumers needs to be secure, and often it is not. It also needs to store data security. It needs to store data securely. Most of these devices do not. Most of these devices also are not transmitting data securely. So both data in rest and data in transit needs to be secured. And finally, many of these manufacturers need to ensure that if they use APIs, those APIs are secure. So let me give you an example of when lack of data security goes wrong in IoT devices. In our first IoT case, the FTC brought an action against TrendNet, which sold internet-connected cameras for purposes ranging from home security to baby monitoring. They call the cameras Secure View, and they advertise them as being very secure, showing locks and similar logos. However, the cameras were not secure. Specifically, the cameras had an option to require direct video stream authentication. Even if you check this off, which was checked off by default, hackers could still go to websites, find TrendNet cameras, and then bypass the login and password by simply adding anani.s/mjpg.cgi to be able to view the camera's feeds. As such, the FTC alleged that the company failed to build security into the design of their products. In addition, we allege that they didn't train their employees, they didn't implement a process for actively monitoring security vulnerabilities, and they didn't perform security tests, including penetration testing. The cameras were simply not built with security by design. So, as I mentioned before, we recognize that security is an ongoing process, which means that IoT companies should have a process for receiving, managing, and addressing security vulnerability reports. In fact, we allege these types of failings in HTC America and Fandango. In addition, rather than focusing on disclosures, we think it's best to provide secure products that receive automatic security updates. If notices to consumers are necessary, we've said, 1, the manufacturer should let consumers know the minimum support period, say 30 months, or state the exact date on which support will stop, for example, January 1st, 2025. For smart devices that can also be dumb devices, say a smart toaster, we recommend pre-sale disclosures if support of the smart aspects of the device will render the dumb aspects of the device unusable. We recommend adopting a uniform notification method for updates, especially if automatic updates are not available. And we recommend helping consumers sign up for notifications about security support, aside from marketing and communications. Finally, we recommend providing real-time notifications when support is about to end. So I promised I would briefly discuss this, but I wanted to highlight that it's not all about policy work and it's not all about law enforcement at the FTC. We're taking steps beyond these prongs to really help the IoT market mature, and more importantly, to improve the consumer experience. So we had this contest which challenged entrants to develop a tool that would help address security issues caused by out-of-date software and IoT devices. And the winning entry is a proposal for a mobile app called IoT Watchdog. It was developed by Steve Castle, and the proposed app would do a few things. First, scan a person's Wi-Fi and Bluetooth networks to gather a list of IoT devices, since it's not always clear what fits under the IoT umbrella. Flag devices that are out-of-date software and other common vulnerabilities. And finally, give instructions on how to update that device software and fix other vulnerabilities. So be on the lookout for IoT Watchdog. So that's it for my presentation. Of course, I encourage you all to look at ftc.gov and business.ftc.gov, where you can access all of our reports and information for free. So you go to business.ftc.gov, you scroll down, and there it is, privacy and security, and you can check all that out. And if you have any questions or anything comes up, if we can't address them today, just send me an email. There's my information. Thank you so much. Any questions? If not, you're shy to ask me here, and I know I can't always answer everything in public. Just feel free to go to my email address and send me those questions. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, and now for our last speaker of the day, Arabella Hallowell from Arbor Networks is going to be presenting on securing enterprise networks. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Arabella from Arbor Networks. Just very brief background on Arbor Networks. Organization has been in business for more than 15 years, helping service providers around the globe, in fact, all of the tier one service providers, as well as enterprise networks, particularly large financial, social media, help protect them against large-scale cyber attacks, particularly DDoS. And as we'll also talk about, one of the defaults and the privileges of protecting these organizations is we've been able to build a real-time internet traffic monitoring capability where we're able to monitor over 1/3 of all internet traffic in near real time, giving us a lot of visibility into both internet traffic but also a lot of attack infrastructure. And so some of the trends that we'll be talking about is due to some of our teams, particularly our ASO research team, and how they look at this data and other data to talk about what they're seeing. So the subject of this, hopefully brief presentation, we're going to switch tracks a bit and talk really about how does IoT, the vector of IoT, change the state of the nation for enterprise networks? How do they need to be thinking about things differently? So just briefly, and for security teams today in the enterprise, they face a pretty significant complex world anyway. So on average, it takes less than 10 minutes for some type of threat actor to penetrate an enterprise network, less than 10 minutes. And that's typically regardless of who the organization is, how big their security team. It's just to do with how porous and open a lot of networks are and how easy it is to get in. What we've seen change significantly over the past 3 years is the threat actor and the different types of vectors and TTPs, the kind of tactics and procedures that they're using. You know, it used to be, if we were having this conversation 4 or 5 years ago, a lot of it was around email, phishing, still very important vectors, as well as, you know, going to a website and downloading a nasty piece of code. We're seeing increasingly that, one, the threat actors themselves are changing complexion. Oftentimes they're hiring using very sophisticated personnel that have a lot of IT backgrounds. Some actually, you know, work professionally, I guess, in their real-time worlds in the IT, you know, in the IT world. So they're using a lot of more detailed sort of IT expertise, and they're using a combination of social networking as well as sort of using IT applications themselves, often harnessing little known vulnerabilities and getting in, and often actually patching things on the way out, so organizations, never even see a trace. And as we've seen in some sort of recent news and headlines, this just leads to general challenges for organizations, dwell time, so how long it actually takes to see real attacks within an enterprise network is still 140 days or more, and actually investigating these threats takes a lot of time for just a normal security team. So when it comes to IoT, it's pretty interesting because for most organizations, they kind of see what's on the surface. If they believe an Internet of Things device isn't really connected to the internet, they're behind a firewall, they're behind some type of, internal device that's protecting them, then they should be fine. We don't let these things on, our real networks. They wouldn't even really get onto a guest network, would they? And so we're going to talk about some of the challenges for organizations because it is a little bit different. Firstly, as we've heard today, many organizations are using consumer-grade IoT devices within their networks. A lot of it is just the overall IT changes where they're often very distributed, and they might be using different types of newer devices that are coming on because they're attractive to the business or it's what they want. It could be anything from environmental systems, from certain types of security cameras, to other types of devices that are consumer grade. And as we've heard about today, oftentimes these devices haven't been built from the get-go with the types of security mechanisms and sort of security by design that often enterprise-grade office equipment has been made with. The second key point for enterprises is IoT devices really take the traditional security models that IT security teams have grown up with and built over the past 20 years off the table. They typically don't have any kind of agents, endpoint sort of security sitting on them looking for different types of new malware that come up. They typically don't have authentication. So those typical security models that every enterprise has sort of grown up with, again, off the table when it comes to IoT devices. And as we'll also talk about, some of the other types of enterprise controls, such as NAC, Network Access Control Systems, often don't apply in these situations. They just can't get all kinds of coverage, and they're imperfect. And so for most organizations, they do have some kind of IoT device that's getting onto their network with an IP address. And this really does result in a greater attack surface. We've all seen the different types of, from refrigerators to electric light bulbs to other types of sort of environmental systems. This just means there's a greater attack surface for the threat actors to go after. And what does this mean? I will just build this out quickly. So what it means is that Defender's reality, which was pretty bad in the beginning, just gets a lot worse when you look at the new vector for IoT. So some recent research, not done by Arbor Networks, looked at a smattering of different IoT devices and found it took less than 3 minutes on average to get in and basically find the vulnerability to that Internet of Things device. So we're talking, in general, fairly vulnerable, fragile types of devices, as we've heard about today. What we're also going to be talking about in a little bit is actually something that some of the security teams have found, the vendor teams have found, and this is newer types of malware that actually infect IoT devices. So I'll talk in a minute about, we actually saw in 2017, in fact the first instances were actually seen in latter 2016 of actual malware that basically can take advantage of IoT devices on the enterprise network for sort of spreading and basically getting that Mirai malware onto all these different IoT devices on an internal network, changes the trajectory. Fortunately, we haven't really seen these be really utilized yet by different threat actors. But as we'll talk about, it does create backdoors for certain types of attacks, including DDoS as well as other campaigns, and also physical damage, particularly when you're talking about cameras, different types of safety systems within a network. We can actually talk about these IoT devices changing the game, not just talking about data, but actual physical harm. And I think as as we've talked about today, when we look at IoT, again, this is a very different vector in many different ways, not just because of the fragility as well as the greater attack surface, but the fact that, it really does cause, significant physical harm if things go awry. So just briefly, I'll talk about the implications of, I know we heard earlier a little bit about, the different types of DDoS attacks using Mirai, but actually what we've seen with now the beginnings of malware that's actually written to spread on IoT devices. This has really interesting implications for enterprises when they think about security and then use security risk with IoT. Essentially, if you get a Windows computer that's infected and can then sort of spread around and look at all the different IoT devices on the network, there's three pretty interesting potential avenues for attack. One is to be able to sort of infect other Internet of Things devices on the network. The second is to launch kind of large-scale outbound DDoS attacks. One, you're a vector for a big attack, but also you can actually DDoS your own network, and particularly if you're a distributed network, that could be a big issue for your organization. And then lastly, they can do reconnaissance and actually look at different types of targets within the organization and how they get there. So there's three pretty interesting implications of basically new types of malware, new types of Trojans and threats that can spread to Internet of Things devices. I won't spend too much time here apart from, again, like the biggest sort of issues are once you have internal Internet of Things devices which are now have the Mirai malware on them, they can cause pretty significant damage in terms of an outbound DDoS attack, as well as if you actually go against the internal network services themselves and create your own internal DDoS attack. So there's some pretty interesting implications here. And so what does it mean in general? For most organizations, it's going to mean a rethink of how they really look at their security architecture. For many, because of new types of trends from using public cloud much more extensively for business-grade applications, as well as other types of trends from flatter networks, more distributed networks, really thinking through now this new vector of IoT devices that are spread amongst your organization, and really they can call out to the internet, they can now spread between your internal network and actually really create havoc against where most organizations have focused, which is, I would say, north-south traffic. These types of internally spreading types of attacks can actually have what's called stateful attacks against your firewall. They go very north-south. And so the new sort of architectures that organizations need to think about need to be much more east-west. The world isn't just flat in terms of the book. I guess it was 15 years ago, but also round. Most security architectures are really built on a north-south basis. And then lastly, just to wrap up a little bit, many enterprises haven't really thought about their security in the same way service providers have. In many ways, some of the new types of internal network threats from an IoT perspective will require them to think a lot more like service providers. So making sure they have much more defined strategies around network segmentation. A lot of organizations have done this in the past, but it just has become much more difficult and complex with more distributed systems, using much more types of internal network scanning to understand what's happening, particularly if you know that those current types of security models where you don't have agents sitting on your IoT devices to make sure they're being checked against the latest types of malware, really understanding if you see abnormal traffic flow, as well as making sure that there's just some sort of basic hygiene done in terms of different types of protocols and other types of services being used to access the internal network. So with that, very brief presentation. I know we're running short on time, but I would like to open it up and see if you had any questions. Anyone? No? Great. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and as a reminder, we will be publishing proceedings from today We did publish a pre-read essay. We're always interested in hearing thoughts on today's presentations. There is contact information on our website, on our program website. We are very interested in collaborating and reaching out and getting feedback from the community, so please don't hesitate. And I believe you're going to be hearing more from us over the next couple of months. Sounds like we have some work we might have to do here at NIST. Thank you again for coming. Oh, yeah. I think either way, if you go to the program page, we'll make sure we have a link there to wherever these are going to be posted. Okay, thanks very much.